मैं आज का पैनल मॉडरेट करूँगी। हमारे पैनल का नाम है फ्रॉम द इल्यूजन ऑफ फ्री ट्रेड टू द रियलिटी ऑफ डेट। और मेरे साथ मौजूद हैं दो स्कॉलर्स, एक डॉक्टर मिस्टर D.W. गिब्सन और स्वेन वैन मोरिक। मिस्टर गिब्सन जो हैं वो एक सहाफ़ी हैं, ही इज़ अ प्रोलिफिक राइटर। उनकी एक किताब जो अभी रिसेंटली आई है 10 Days to Change the World, हम ज़्यादा तक हमारी जो डिस्कशन है वो उस पर फोकस करेगी। और हमारे साथ मौजूद हैं डॉक्टर स्वेन वैन मोरिक, जो एक ऐसे टॉपिक पे रिसर्च करते हैं जो हम पाकिस्तानियों के लिए बहुत ही ज़्यादा अहम है, और वो है IMF के जो स्ट्रक्चरल एडजस्टमेंट प्रोग्राम्स हैं वो हमारे जैसे डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज़ को किस तरह से इम्पैक्ट करते हैं। द कॉन्वर्सेशन विल बी इन इंग्लिश, सो फ्रॉम दिस पॉइंट आई एम गोइंग टू स्विच टू इंग्लिश and Sven, I'll start with you, if you don't mind. So, you recently wrote a paper about this idea that there is this opaque group of creditors called the Paris Club, and your structural adjustment programs are signals to this Paris Club of your credit worthiness, and that's when they decide whether your debt should be restructured. So can you, for your audience, first break down what this Paris Club is, and what is the link between this Paris Club, just flesh it out, the link between this Paris Club and your structural adjustment programs.
Right, and the topic.
Yes, of course.
Let me start with a quick question for everyone in the audience. Who has heard of the Paris Club before? If I could see some hands. The Paris Club. No one? Okay, that's usually what it's like. So you're in good company with a lot of other academics and scholars. I think to explain what it is and to set the stage maybe a bit for our conversation today, let me briefly tell you why I got interested in this topic. So there was a big financial crisis in Europe in 2008, and I was back in high school at the time, and I saw the news, and I saw that in Greece, which is part of the European Union, like the Netherlands, my own country, there was this IMF program being implemented, and it was having all sorts of devastating effects. Suicide rates went up, infant mortality went up, HIV infections went up. It really gripped me. I wanted to know why creditors like the Netherlands insisted that a country implement an IMF program, even though it led to such devastation. Now, when I started researching this, I realized, of course, that Greece is not the only country that's gone through this, right? Greek scholars were referring back to the Asian financial crisis in 1997. They were referring back to Eastern European countries in the early 90s. They were referring back to African countries in the 1980s. And what I realized during my research was that looking at the 1980s and Africa in specific, there were all these finance ministry officials from Africa saying, we don't want to implement an IMF program. We know that the IMF program is not going to work, but we sign an IMF program because we need to get our debt restructured with the Paris Club. Now, the Paris Club of Creditors, to give you the brief technical definition, is an ad hoc gathering of Western finance ministry representatives, and they come together to restructure or reschedule often the debt of a country that's about to default. So when a country can no longer pay its debt programs, the Paris Club, Western creditors come together and say, okay, you can postpone your interest payments by so many months. However, the only condition they have is you have to implement an IMF program. And these programs, of course, as I'm sure some of you will know, had very big consequences. They led to free trade, which has all sorts of negative effects, which I'm sure Mr. Gibson will talk about as well. But this is how I became interested in the Paris Club, as this sort of constellation of creditors behind the IMF that sort of enforces the implementation of these programs.
So, just a question from this. In your paper, you say this is not a formal institution, but rather, and it doesn't have a structure, it doesn't really have rules, it's like you just said, ad hoc. So how does that work? Like, what is the origin of this idea that, these group of ministers have to get together and, and in your paper you also mentioned that, it's like a one against all kind of format, which, it's just one person who's sitting against these
No, exactly.
Deciders of their fate.
Yeah. So the Paris Club is pretty secretive, right? Very few people know about it, as we saw just now, right? And you're not alone. It's also most politicians, most academics won't know about it, and this is on purpose. It's going to sound like a conspiracy theory. It actually sort of looks a little bit like that when you look closely, but there's a functional reason for it. When you're rescheduling a country's debt, the last thing you want as a creditor, but actually also usually in the short-term interest of the debtor state, you don't want to politicize it. You don't want to have national newspapers saying like, oh, we're restructuring the debt, or we're repaying so much, or so. The chairman of the Paris Club usually are pretty proud of the fact that it's secretive. It makes it very efficient. They can just get it done with. It's a technocratic thing. They don't have to think too much about it. They don't have to publicize it. Now, this is not always in the long-term interest of the debtor country, of course. And yeah, what you often see is one country coming to Paris and then facing all of his creditors at the same time. So it's sort of like a one versus all scenario, a very unequal power imbalance.
And the operating framework is the Washington Consensus, or?
Yeah, so this is what these IMF programs turn into over time,
Yeah.
right? The original impetus is like, how do we restructure a country so that it can repay its debt? This is really the foundation of the IMF programs. How do we make sure you can reliably pay your interest payments so that you can be a functional part of global finance? And then on top of that, when that wasn't really working, they started adding all sorts of other things, like, oh, you have to open your borders to free trade, you have to deregulate, you have to privatize, all of these things that we now know as the Washington Consensus. But were actually added on top of this idea, like, how do we get this country to reliably repay its debt?
And so the one thing that I noticed that was common between the both of you is that your research methodology is oral histories. So why did you pick oral history specifically as a way to describe?
It's the only way.
It's the only way.
I mean, it's not.
There's no documentation.
It's not the only way, but
Okay.
there's no documentation. They don't keep minutes. There's no. There is an official site, and they publish some very minimal numbers on reschedulings. But I mean, this is an institution that's a non-institution, right? That's rescheduled $500 billion of debt in the last 50 years. There are dozens of countries that have come in. This is a hugely important part of the global financial machinery, but there's no documentation. So as a researcher, what was really interesting is having to go to all of the peripheral archives. So you look at the World Bank archives, they see what they write about the Paris Club. You go to the IMF archives, you see what they write about the Paris Club. So this was my approach, until I realized it's much more interesting to actually talk to the people. And most of them only want to talk anonymously, but you do get very interesting anecdotes, and it becomes a very human story, especially when you talk to debtor country representatives.
Have you ever spoken to someone from the Paris Club?
I've spoken to people who attend Paris Club meetings, yes, several, almost all of them anonymously.
Okay. Okay, so I'll now pivot to you, Mr. Gibson. You wrote this book, which came out last year, 10 Days to Change the World, and it was marking the 25th anniversary of what is called the Battle of Seattle. Before I came across your book, I had no idea about the Battle of Seattle and the fact that there was such a big resistance movement to the World Trade Organization and the, kind of the one-size-fits-all liberalization formula that they were, other countries were being asked to adhere to. So in your book, you start off with the people that you've interviewed are talking about the Y2K, the year 2000 coming up, and there was this, this anxiety around it. There was some part of it was like technological anxiety, as if the world is going to end, and then there was also an immense sense of possibility that we're going to break the system and change the world. So can you talk about a little bit of the context of the decades of the 90s, which led up to the Battle of Seattle, and then we'll talk more about the battle itself.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, so as you said, it was this book that I worked on recounts, it's an oral history of a protest in Seattle on the west coast of the US in 1999. And the atmospherics were really certain. It was the end of a millennium, right? And for those in the audience that remember this time, it was defined by this term Y2K, right? This notion that when all of the computers switched over to the year 2000, they would come crashing down because they couldn't handle the challenge of two new zeros in the date, right? And the world was fixated on this. Software companies around the world made lots of money selling materials that you could help protect your computer from this impending disaster. So there was that sense of change in the air, right? A new millennium. It redounded to cultural touchstones. A big American film at the time was a film called Fight Club. It was all about people coming together to have fights that they celebrated, to get out sort of aggression. And this was a real thing. This was a phenomenon that you saw in the US. You saw fight clubs across cities where people would come in the evening and have fights and get out aggression. So it was a time of much angst and anxiety, but also a time of, okay, what can happen here? How this sense of pivoting to a new millennium, and what does that mean in terms of opportunity to reorganize the world, to reorganize how nation states interact with each other. And there was a lot of energy in the activist communities, certainly in the US and beyond. Yeah. And should I go ahead and just sort of describe?
Please, please.
Yeah. Because if it's okay, I'd like to take like 4 minutes to read the first 2 pages of the book, because I think it really, the people I interviewed do a much better job at giving us a sense of what happened in Seattle better than I could. So, and just to give you a sense of how it's put together, I interviewed over 100 people that were involved in the protests, not just protesters, but also law enforcement that cracked down on the protesters, and politicians, and people that were involved in all kinds of ways. I tried to create a panoramic of voices. I think about it as sort of like a chorus of voices, and they tell the story. My job was, as much as I could, to stay out of the way. So I'm going to read 2 pages, and I'm not going to tell you all of the voices you'll hear. If you were to see the book, you would see the names of the people speaking. But you're going to, over the course of these 2 pages, hear about 10 different people speak. And in a way, a lot of the times it doesn't necessarily matter who's speaking. It's just the narrative that they're driving forward. So I'll just read straight through with what they say, and I think this will give us very good context. The fight was over the World Trade Organization. A large part of establishing the WTO in 1995 was to create a participative, consensus-based international organization, not unlike the United Nations. It was created to establish rules of the road for international trade, and to have a way to enforce those rules when countries go rogue. The WTO, like many international organizations, has always been about acceptance of reduced sovereignty in the name of common good. Something like, given the problems we all have, I accept that we constrain my country's sovereignty in the name of global benefit. The WTO was there to move power from the local and national level into a set of global rules written by the world's largest corporations at the exclusion of civil society. That raises concerns for a lot of people. It was establishing the ability to supersede and effectively overrule what the nation state might do. So even if you won the legislative battle at home, you could be overridden on the global level. The rules being written were things like, you can only have this much food safety. Anything else is a trade barrier. Or, the labeling system you have, it's an illegal trade barrier. Or, you can't have this kind of investment rule. You can't have regulated services. All of it was viewed by the WTO as illegal trade barriers. People didn't realize that under the rules of the WTO, it's illegal to ban products based on production methods. One of the only things you're allowed to ban is prison labor. But if you say, we don't want these products in our country because they're made under exploitative conditions, or because they're made in ways that damage the environment, it's actually illegal to say we don't want those products circulating in our country. We were telling people this in 1999, and they said, well, we should be able to decide these things. And we were saying, yeah, that's why we don't like the WTO. People were seeing the ways in which everybody was affected, no matter what issues were important to you: the environment, human rights, social justice, sweatshop issues. This unchecked globalization of trade was going to affect all of us. It was a battle of ideology. One was a vision of a single constitution for global corporate governance, which is what the first director of the WTO had said was needed. The alternative was making trade rules for countries according to what was interesting to their people and their governments, rules about what they would do when they decided to trade, not one-size-fits-all top-down corporate governance. You can learn from history that there has always been an element of confrontation. Whether it's been labor strikes or civil rights sit-ins or suffrage movement, you need to have a confrontation. We needed to have a massive confrontation, put our bodies on the line, and create a crisis. And so that's what 50,000 people did in Seattle, Washington in 1999 over the course of 5 days, over the course of a week. The WTO was meeting for their ministerial, and those 50,000 people had one goal. It was to shut down those meetings and not allow the WTO to reach a new sweeping agreement. And they achieved that goal. The first day of the ministerial was shut down because 50,000 people were in the streets blocking 13 key intersections, so the delegates of the WTO physically could not attend the meetings. They couldn't get into the building, so they couldn't conduct the first day of meetings. The rest of the meetings all week never really got back on track, and they had to leave town abruptly without an agreement. So the protesters set a goal for themselves, and they met that goal. I can tell you in U.S. context, that's rare. That doesn't happen, especially on this scale. You have to go back in the U.S. context again to civil rights era of the 1960s and those efforts. So it was very, very meaningful in that way. And I was in the same position where I wasn't really familiar with this, and that's what drove me to write this book, is because I felt like stylistically and substantively these protests were so important, and you can see their fingerprints all over some of the movements we've seen since, from Occupy Wall Street movement in the US to social justice movements around the world. And the final point to make too is that many of the organizers that I interviewed, the American organizers who were working with organizers all around the world, these 50,000 people came from all around the world, they all acknowledged, the US protesters, that they were taking their cues from organizers, in some cases in Europe, but mostly in the global South. That's where the energy was, that's where the organizing had already been against debt consolidation and globalization, and so US protesters were trying to catch up with their counterparts in the global South.
So, you document this iconic phrase from Seattle, Teamsters and Turtles together at last, where labor unions and environmental activists, they came together, groups that are traditionally, they see each other as enemies. So what made that alliance possible in 1999, and why has it been so difficult to recreate since?
Yeah. So there was something, I think there's a couple of parts to that answer. One of it is the space and time that we were talking about, 1999. This is the beginning of the internet, right? This is the first opportunity to use the internet as an organizing tool. Right? So you were able to message out to farmers in France, hey, look, we're upset here in Seattle. We're going to have a big protest. Do you want to come join? Right? That became possible in a way that it hadn't before. So you had that new tool to use. But also it was also about messaging. Right? So there were many groups, labor unions, arts organizations that went around the U.S. for a year before the ministerial meeting. And they had what they called teach-ins all around the U.S. and other places, but really it was concentrated in the U.S. to gather in physical spaces like this and to talk about the WTO, why it mattered to people, to make it a real issue. You're a farmer, this is how it affects your crop, right? You're an environmentalist, this is how it affects the matters you're concerned about. You're a union member, this is how it affects the work that you do, right? They made it real for people in physical spaces where they talked through the issues. So by the time the WTO came to town, everybody in Seattle, in terms of people actually living there, and everybody who had come there, knew why it mattered to them. And so that communication, that messaging was key. And I think it's important to note, too, that it was happening in physical space. I think what's happened since, to your question about why is it proven so difficult to do in the years since then, is because I think we've gone to a place where we view the internet not so much as a tool in a tool belt of many things we can do, but as the way we do things. And I was at the Palestinian protest at Columbia University, that we've all heard about over the last few years, and I was talking to some of the protesters there, and it was interesting because they were looking around for some people that they were meeting to do an action there at the protest, and they were having trouble finding them, and they realized when they had arrived that they did not know what the people looked like who they had been organizing with online for so very long. They'd been communicating for weeks and weeks and weeks, but they didn't know who the individuals were that they were looking for, right? So there's a disconnect there. So I think there's some balancing act we need to find in the age of social media where we harness social media as an organizing tool, but yet we also find ways to come together in the physical world and build community on a very hyper-localized level and build organizing on a hyper-localized level.
Okay, so one more question generally on the same theme. A very striking detail in your book is that money from Roger Milligan helped fund anarchist protesters through various channels. So today we see Trump and Bernie criticizing free trade, but coming from opposite direction. Actually, that's the same kind of in places like France, where Mélenchon and what's the right-wing person? Le Pen. So they're also so it's like approaching from. They're talking about the same thing, but they're coming from opposite sides. So what does Seattle teach us about building coalitions across political divides?
Yeah, so and it was like, we had priests and anarchists, you had students and farmers, you had union members. It was a vast array of people, left, right, coalition. And actually, when I was working on this book, a lot of people were very uncomfortable talking about that. And I think that's largely because of Donald Trump. And because, again, I can only really speak to a US context, but the arguments against globalization have been really usurped by the right. The left, in the many ways it has failed in the US, this is one of the key ways it has failed. It has lost an argument, an engagement in debate about globalization. It's just sort of at some point during the Clintonian era accepted it as sort of just the way the world works. And Donald Trump and figures like him have come into that space and completely taken it over. So I think the people on the left sort of need to recognize, first of all, just as historic fact, recognize that those coalitions are possible. And really, at the end of the day, we decide where we channel our energy. I meet you, we talk about 10 things, we disagree on 9, we agree on 1, and we can decide. We can decide that we want to fixate on those 9 things that we disagree on, or we can work together on that one thing we agree on. And that's the critical decision-making process we have as individuals in the communities that we live in and organize in.
Okay, so and I'll come back. Go on, please.
Can I just briefly pivot? Yeah, no, I think this is really interesting, right? Because it's implicit in what you're saying is communication, right? Communication, and not just in a political spectrum. Because one thing that I notice, and I find this very interesting in what you just said, is the spaces and temporalities where discussion takes place. So there's one strand of the anti-globalization movement that you've studied as it culminated in Seattle, which I find very interesting, and it's this broad north-south, very grassroots initiative to forgive debt of the poorest countries. And it starts in the late 1970s, and it's successful in the early 2000s. So that's over 2 decades of very slow communication, grassroots organizing. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have today political revolutions that can take place like this over Discord, right? So there's a real mismatch there, and I think there's ways that we can learn from both of these 2 ways of organizing, but I do think, to come back to the thing that you said at the very end, it starts in communication. It starts in actually, maybe to some extent, ignoring the politicians for a second and really formulating our own demands and making connections.
Yeah, and that those examples you gave of a 30-year cycle of something developing and something sort of developing seemingly overnight, I think there are relationships between those 2 things. Energies that are latent, that all of the ingredients come together to make them become more kinetic and active. I think there's a relationship between the 2. Yeah.
And there's also, sorry, one last thing. There's also this danger in that sometimes, right? That one thing that I liked in what you said is that they set a goal and they achieved it. But this is also a problem, because what happens after you achieve the goal, right? Yeah. For the movement for debt forgiveness, they got the debt forgiven in the early 2000s, and it was great until the next debt crisis, and then you have the exact same thing over again, and you have the exact same problem again. So there's also this sense in which we need to learn also from these movements and be broader in our demands and more nuanced. And yeah, sorry, Aima.
No, I'm enjoying this. Okay, so on the theme of protest, so your paper mentions bread riots and IMF riots in 39 countries, and I think Pakistan has also had a bunch of very serious protests against these structural adjustment programs, and even leaders getting overthrown for implementing these programs. So can you tell us a specific story that illustrates that these structural adjustment programs, what they actually meant for ordinary people? I mean, I know you gave the example of Greece, but from your research, I think you focused on Latin American and African countries. So.
Yeah. So okay, let me very briefly give you three very different
Please.
examples. So what happens at the baseline with an IMF program, right, is you need to repay your debt, and we're going to help you restructure your economy so that you can repay your debt. And the very first version of these programs were very crude. It was just cut all of your expenses as much as you can as a government, and then we'll take it from there. Now, in practice, this meant for dozens of countries that they were getting rid of subsidies that existed in the 70s on food, fuel, medicine. So on a very basic level, there were these huge protests that erupted and often put down by violent means by militaries for people who just wanted to be able to pay for bread, right? They wanted to be able to pay for medicine. They wanted to be able to pay for fuel. And you see this again and again and again. This is a very broad wave of protests. Interestingly, I talked to an IMF official who was active at the time, a Dutch official, who looked back, and I asked him about these bread riots, right, which were also called SAP riots, Structural Adjustment Program riots, or IMF riots. And he said, yeah, no, it was still necessary what they had to do. To him, it was a law of finance, right? You can't pay for your budget, cut your budgets. Now, that's in a very kind of like macro level. On a personal level, I went to Greece, and I had a scholar who was also interested in structural adjustment programs, and she was interested because after the 2008 crisis, her mother passed away because there wasn't adequate health care. That's within the last decade in Western Europe, right? So this is to some extent, very different degrees, but to some extent, something that affects all of us. And I think that's what inspires me as well about this problem, is that we're gonna have to fix this together, right? We're gonna, like north, south, like very wealthy, very poor countries, they all face ultimately a set of similar constraints. And to just give you one final example, this is not just people that face this problem, right? It's also actually politicians and finance ministers. There's this sort of collective disciplining that happens at the level of the nation state, where often progressive politicians, but also sometimes right-wing politicians, get punished for choosing their own people. A famous example is in Peru in 1985, when President Alan Garcia said, okay, we'll repay the debt, but we're going to repay to a maximum of 10% of our export earnings. So we're going to pay 10% of our export earnings in debt, and that's where we'll leave it because we're having a hard time. By the end of the decade, for different reasons, and it's complex, I won't get into it, but inflation had reached over 1,000%, right? So the economy was collapsing. Creditors were pulling away. Peru was not to be trusted on international financial markets. And the president turned around 180 degrees. In the 1990s, when he came back to power, later he implemented the most neoliberal Washington consensus IMF line on credibility, because he had gone through this really traumatic experience of trying to take his own line and getting disciplined. For various reasons, he ended up taking his own life in the early 2000s. And there's many stories like this, also for finance ministry officials. So when I say it's a collective trap, it's also a trap for the people that actually implement these policies sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think are they attuned to the human cost of what they're asking governments to implement? Or do you think they've like divorced themselves from that? Like healthcare is a very real,
Yeah.
it's an essential.
Yeah.
And
No, they're not in tune. And in fact, I talked to some people who were fighting on behalf of these debt forgiveness schemes, right? That were saying, like, just forgive the debt. It's not actually that much debt to begin with, yada, yada, yada. And they tried to take Western finance ministry officials to Latin America, I forget, somewhere on the eastern coast, to show them the impact in, I think it was in Brazil, in the slums of these programs. And these officials, they were like, what are you trying to do? You're trying to guilt trip us. You're trying to make us feel bad about our work. And there's this this is very heavily guarded cognitive dissonance, I think, that if you try to break through it, people feel personally attacked. Because I think, to some extent, the only reason you can do this kind of work is by closing your eyes to the effects, consciously or unconsciously. And that doesn't make them bad people, but that is a very specific challenge we face.
It just makes for a bad way of doing things with like people with good intentions, but who just have internalized.
Capitalism ultimately requires dehumanization, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So on that theme, Sven, I want to talk to you about the violence that is required to keep these international financial structures in place, you know, against protesters, but also, you know, finance ministry officials. And
Yeah, you know what, I think maybe
Okay.
ask Mr. Gibson to talk about this first, because I
Okay.
think he has very concrete examples, I'm sure, of the Seattle protests, and after I can maybe pivot back, but
Okay.
yeah.
Wait, sorry, reword the essence of what you were asking there?
To him, I was asking him what is the, you know, the violence that is required to keep these adjustment programs against protesters. So in your context, in the context of the Battle of Seattle, there is this interesting difference I see between what the mayor of Seattle feels about the protests and what the Clinton administration feels about the protests, and then what the police is feels like it is required to do. So can you talk about this, you know, contradiction that exists?
Yeah. So you had you know, another way that the battle in Seattle is really important and continues to reverberate is it's the beginning of the militarization of police and law enforcement in the U.S., which we see now in full bloom under the Trump administration. But Seattle is where it began. And so you had the organizers had 50,000 people. You got a lot of different people, a lot of different interests, a lot of different ways to go about protesting. The two examples I like to give that show sort of the breadth of approaches to organizing. So they had these 13 intersections they needed to block so that no one could get to the meetings. And they divided up into affinity groups to block those intersections. And each affinity group was allowed to decide how they wanted to block the intersection. The only rule was it had to be nonviolent. You could not incorporate violence into what you were doing. And by and large, 50,000 people did that. There were some exceptions, and that sort of became the media story in the US and really sort of got in the way of what had actually telling the story of what had happened. But that's sort of a sideshow. 50,000 people, by and large, all agreed, okay, whatever we want to do, but just nonviolence. So the range of that, on one end, you had people blocking intersections with what you called dragon sleeves or lock boxes. They would sit down in the intersection and they connected their arms with piping, where they could put their hands inside the piping, lock their hands inside the piping, and you couldn't move. They formed a circle of 12 or 20 human beings that couldn't be moved unless you brought in saws to cut the piping apart and remove the individuals. Very serious, hardcore tactics that had already been used in various other parts of the world. On the other end of the spectrum, you had a group of 60-something grandmothers that called themselves the Red Noses, and they wore red clown noses. And they got into an intersection, and their approach was to stop the delegates as they tried to get through and ask the delegates to wear clown noses too, and to try to engage them in conversation, try to make them laugh. There's a few pictures of it in the book, and you can see, I think it's actually one of them, I think it's a Dutch delegate, I can't remember, but he puts the nose on and he's laughing and he's engaging them a little bit. You see many more people very angry with him and trying to scoot by them, right? But the point is, everyone could use whatever tactics they wanted. And the key is that the law enforcement just could not abide by the fact that they were succeeding, right? So the local police department, the local chief of police, he confesses in the book that his heart was with the protesters. So he kind of just goes missing. He goes rogue. And the mayor really wanted the protesters to have some space. So he created sort of liberal municipal rules that allowed them to do all of this. But then Bill Clinton's coming to town. So the FBI, the federal police, right, and the Secret Service, the security detail for Bill Clinton said, no, this can't happen. This has to end, right? And this is happening hour by hour and hour by hour. So as it gets closer to the arrival of Clinton getting to the WTO, the police are made to become more and more forceful. And eventually the federal police take over. And they remove people violently by approaching, again, people sitting in the street, spraying pepper spray directly into their eyes, pulling them away violently, hauling them off by the hundreds to jail without any engagement or actual charges. And so that's the first time you see that in the U.S. context, in terms of federal police dictating what the local police are doing in a holistic way. And again, that sort of is becoming absolutely normalized in the U.S. context. But what that does is that shows you that capitalism will preserve itself at all costs, right? So the police are there to protect you so long as you're aligned with the state's interest. And the moment you aren't anymore, you become the enemy, and you become sort of the violence that needs to be dealt with. The irony is you're practicing nonviolent protest, and the police are the ones bringing the violence. They've been widely recognized in the long run as police riots, and it's been widely recognized the police instigated all of the violence that was there. Various lawsuits that played out over a decade or more as people took the police to court.
So did they win?
Did they win? Well, to Sven's point, they won the battle, but not the war, right? So I'd say they knew what they wanted to accomplish that week, and they were so clear-eyed about it, and they did it, but they weren't quite sure about what came next. Now, and I don't want to give excuses or anything, but many things happened in the sort of immediate aftermath of these protests. Chief among them was 9/11. Right? So you had so much organizing in 2000. After this happened in Seattle, there was so much energy, right? We did it. We did exactly what we wanted to do. And there was organizing around IMF meetings that were coming to Washington. They were going to duplicate the efforts. They were going to keep it going. Union members who had been very hesitant to help block those intersections in Seattle, they were now saying, all right, we're all in. We saw that it works. We're going to do it. And then 9/11 came in. And so all of the energy got channeled into the anti-war movement. And, you know, Lisa Fithian, one of the organizers, said, you know, that was just devastating because when you're talking about pushing back on capitalism, you can create such large coalitions across political divides. And when you are talking about anti-war movements, it becomes about patriotism, and it's much easier to break apart those coalitions of activists that are developing. And so that was a very key moment where a lot of the movement, particularly in the U.S., broke apart.
So Sven, do you now want to answer my question?
I was stalling.
Okay.
No, I think actually this is a nice way to turn back and to speak to briefly to two quick points. One is this question of violence, which you asked about.
Yes.
But then the other is this question, which you mentioned at the start, that in one of the quotes, that this is really about self-determination, right? If Mexico wants to put labels on sugary drinks saying like, hey, this is not good, the US can go through international courts and legislation to say like, no, this is obstructing capital, this is obstructing free trade. You cannot do this to our products, right? And they can win. So this is about a certain economic self-determination. Now what you see often is that from the outside it looks like it's finance ministry officials that will give away the sovereignty over economic and financial policy of their country to foreign creditors and essentially agree to an IMF program and say like, okay, we will take down our trade barriers, or okay, we will privatize, or okay, we will cut the state budget by so many percentages, right? That's what it looks like on the outside, but I think the violence that is involved in keeping capitalism as a system going is not just towards protesters. It's also sometimes, what I've noticed in talking to these people, right, which is when some of these stories come up, is it's also against finance ministry officials, because imagine being a minister of finance and you have the choice, either you go with the IMF or next month the Paris Club decides that they're not going to restructure your debt, you default, and because the Paris Club is closely aligned to commercial banks as well and all sorts of other creditors, financial flows stop going into your country, including, for instance, short-term trade credits, which is necessary to buy medicine, to buy food, to buy fuel. We saw this recently in Sri Lanka. And they're still undergoing severe effects of malnutrition and undernutrition. Almost a year after they already agreed to an IMF program, because for several months food imports stopped. This is the worst case scenario for a government in some ways, right, in the short term. Now in Sri Lanka they occupied the presidential palace, you had all these photos, right, people in the presidential swimming pool. That's what you don't want as a government, but also in a broader sense you don't want hunger, you want people to have medicine, you want people to have fuel. This is the leverage that creditors have. So on the one hand, right, you're a finance minister and you see this and you're like, okay, we gotta come to terms with the IMF on some level, right? On the other hand, and this is one anecdote I like to use, which is from actually a sort of somewhat debt forgiveness scenario in 2004, 2005, where Nigeria completed the biggest Paris Club per scheduling, one of the biggest in its history. And they got half of their debt forgiven, several billion, I think. But they also had to repay several billion. And protesters in Nigeria went on the street and were like, this is neo-colonial, we're not going to repay our creditors. Now, the finance minister at the time was a very impressive woman, Nkonjo Iweala. She was a former World Bank official, and as she was negotiating this deal, which she thought was a good deal for her country, right, financial stability, repaying the debt, getting some forgiveness, people kidnapped her mother. So people kidnapped the finance minister's mother in Nigeria. And when she was safe in the end, but their demands were not money. Their demand was like, you have to step down as finance minister. You have to go back to Washington, D.C., where you come from. It says in her memoirs. So finance ministry officials are also in this bind. And there are several instances of violence against these officials for having to negotiate what's essentially an impossible choice in the current system, which is not to, make light of their decisions and the consequences, but it does show you, it's easy to point at someone, but in the end, it is a systemic issue as well.
So on that note, actually, countries like Pakistan, we are so acutely aware of what these IMF bailouts mean for us. So it's actually like a point for political organizing as well, and it's a political agenda that parties have. They say, when we come to power, we will not go to IMF. So there's a very famous, one of our political leaders, he very famously before coming to power, he said, I would rather commit suicide than go to the IMF. But when he came to power, they tried very hard in the first few months to figure it out in a way that they didn't have to, but they had to. And it was accepted logic. If you spoke to any economist, any commentator who was watching these things, they would say, of course you have to. There's no other way. So I want to ask you, why do countries keep coming back for these programs when we know that it is essentially suicide for your people?
Because in a way, we don't live in a world of countries. We live in a world of global financial flows. Mm-hmm. That's the world that we've created. There is $100 million of foreign investment, flashing across the world every second. That's almost $10 trillion a day. These are the forces that nation states have to deal with. And what happens is that, there is no point at which a state has too much debt. There's no magical line at which someone somewhere says, like, hey, you broke the rule, now you're in too much debt. It is the consequence of a game of collective confidence. Where do investors pull out, right? What are the signals that tell you that a country is not worthwhile investing in, that a country can suddenly be drained of all capital? Now, it's very silly how investors come to that kind of realization, but they do come to it together. So if you send the wrong signals as a country, you can suddenly face a reversal of capital flows. And it takes very strong persistence and a very strong power position to go into the face of these flows. I'll give one quick example, which was perhaps in some ways the most hopeful and last real attempt to go into the face of these flows, and that was in the early 1980s by France. France had elected a socialist president, François Mitterrand. He wanted to prioritize French business, prioritize a French national economic development strategy that was French-based, that put up certain trade barriers. Within 2 years, he made what is now known among historians as the U-turn of François Mitterrand, and he implemented a more neoliberal, a historical term, but neoliberal, let's say, right-wing program than even the right wing in France would have implemented. I still think he had a choice, but the consensus is sort of, he was disciplined. He was disciplined by financial markets. So I think that points us to a collective issue again that all countries face, which is how do we together organize in the face of global finance? If anyone has any ideas, I would love to.
No, so I actually want to ask you, so then what would institutional reform look like? And can we build alternative institutions that can give countries a way out or a different path?
Okay, I'll give an answer, but I also really want to hear your thoughts on this. My brief answer to that is yes, but it would require sort of probably grassroots organizing and interstate north-south cooperation in a way that we haven't really seen before. So I think it is an unprecedented challenge. I find it hopeful that groups like the BRICS are now calling, for instance, for voting right reforms in
Right.
IMF. This happened several months ago, which is a good thing, right? Because IMF is controlled by the global north. It requires 85% vote for any major changes. The US owns 16% of the vote in the IMF. So the US alone can veto anything that the IMF does, right? So voting rights reform in institutions like the IMF is important. But I think at the end of the day, this really is about how do we create the financial underpinnings in the face of global capital flows that allow all countries to individually set out their own path without being punished by financial markets the moment they do anything that is disadvantageous to global capital.
Yeah, and I would, the flow of money is the organizing principle of the world. And so it's like recognizing that fact. And I think for me, the primary issue is the impotence of democracy that we see. And democracy needs to assert itself. So in the US context, we have people like tech billionaire Peter Thiel openly talking about dissolution of nation state, right? Trying to openly embrace the idea that the flow of capital is how we organize the world, and let's dissolve nation state and have the world be governed by capitalism. Like that's the pursuit. And so can democracy push back on that is the question, I think. And by democracy, I don't mean nation states. I don't mean the US government or the government of Pakistan. I mean demos. I mean you and me, people. Can we organize, can we push back in ways that says, nope, the flow of capital isn't going to be the way the world is organized. We reject that. Because I got to tell you, Peter Thiel has a lot more money than I do, but we are a lot more people than he is, right? And that's just, I'm using him as a placeholder. There are other examples. But it requires that kind of coalition building. And I think that, again, that goes back to some beautiful amalgam of the age of social media and hyper-localized efforts. I'll give you one example. A French farmer named José Bouvier was in Seattle. He brought in like 500 pounds of Roquefort cheese, which was illegal, right? A trade issue. And he put out some tablecloths in front of a McDonald's in Seattle and started handing out the cheese for everybody. His story of getting that cheese through customs is very funny. But that sort of, he organized farmers in France. He gained a lot of notoriety by driving his tractor into a construction site where they were trying to build a McDonald's, and actually went to prison for that for a little while. Then he became a member of parliament. But Jose talks really well about how it was so exciting in 1999, and the possibilities are so much grander in 2025 for a group of French farmers to connect with a group of Korean farmers or Brazilian farmers and share strategies, right? So you're always focusing on what matters to you and your neighbors and the people that have the same concerns with that stoplight and that pothole in the street and that school that stinks and that bank that stinks. You guys know that because that's your community, that's your world. But people far, far away have their own version of that. So finding ways to do the organizing and the actions locally, but sharing tactics and energy.
Go on.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. You know, one thing that's really interesting, I think, is that at the end of the day, we do sort of want similar things, right? And you see very obvious examples right now, for instance, in protests for Palestine that are happening across Europe. Thank God, especially in Italy, but also in the Netherlands. And I've seen some of that happening.
Great example, yeah.
And it's like you look at this on the news, and you're like, hey, wait, okay, we want the same thing apparently, or at least there are people that want the same thing in very different places. And it gives hope and it inspires. And sometimes that also, if you look more closely, can bring groups together that seem opposed. So I'll give one quick example which doesn't have too much to do with the topic, but it's I'm making a documentary about Dutch farmers, right, who have been like protesting certain environmental regulations, and it at some point occurred to me that it's very interesting to see all these farmer tractors occupy highways and go to the political seat in The Hague and talk to politicians, and to put that juxtaposed to some of these incredibly large climate marches that we have in Amsterdam. And you look at these two groups and you're like, okay, you know, one is painted as more right-wing, one is painted as more left-wing, one wants to prioritize the environment, the other wants to prioritize farming. But actually what you realize after a while is like, no, farmers are being extorted by big industry. They have to pursue smaller and smaller, larger and smaller profit margins with bigger and bigger expansions. Now, as it happens, one of the best ways to, especially in the Netherlands for different ecological reasons, one of the best ways to prioritize the environment is more farmers who farm on smaller farms and get paid for that, right? So this is one of those instances where, to me, my mind was blown, and these two seemingly opposing groups actually are, if you rephrase it slightly, fighting for the exact same thing. And so recognizing that in each other and pursuing intersectionality and finding that hope and that connection, I think, is really the thing that will drive this forward to whatever hopeful end we can imagine.
Okay, so if you think we've covered everything, or is there anything that we haven't?
We've covered it all. We've solved it all done.
Yeah. People of the world unite. No, so then I think we should take some questions. We have like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And so I think we can take some questions from the audience. So please, I think mic मिल सकती है?
Here we go.
Great conversation. You shared 3 cases of Greece, Peru, and Nigeria. Have you studied Pakistan? We are regular client of IMF, like 23 times. Our main problem is balance of payment. Our exports are generally $20 billion and imports are $30 billion. So our economy overheats and then government put down the foot on the imports. So what are your lessons for Pakistan?
Okay, I'm very tempted to go really into depth and bring up a lot of technical issues. I'll try to keep it simple, but I'm happy to discuss more later. Very briefly, the balance of payments issues, this is why the IMF was founded. If you have one country that imports more and the other that exports more, how do you find balance? Now, there were a lot of debates about this at the founding of the IMF in 1944. There were some people that were saying, okay, creditor countries, surplus countries should adjust a bit, and debtor countries should adjust a bit, and then they find balance, right? So for instance, a creditor country should import more from debtor countries and should maybe increase its consumption so that the debtor country can increase its exports, and then we find a balance, right? Were even people saying, Schumpeter amongst others at the time, actually creditor countries should bear all of the burden of adjustment. Now, for various reasons, the way that the post-war financial system was designed was in the interest of the United States, overruling countries like Britain and John Maynard Keynes, who was a famous economist, who argued for this kind of balanced adjustment, to a system where the adjustment is only on debtor countries. Creditor countries have no responsibility whatsoever in a case of an imbalance. It's only debtor countries that have to adjust. So in the case of Pakistan, I hesitate to offer any concrete advice, but I do know that the former Prime Minister said something very remarkable in 2020 during the COVID pandemic when he said, like, oh, we need some kind of debt forgiveness scheme, right? And to me, this is the same solution that we had 20 years ago, which helped. But it doesn't solve the problem, because the next time there's a crisis, you have that same dynamic of adjustment. So I think we really need to revisit the way we've designed the IMF and go back to a system where, at the very least, creditor and debtor countries bear the burden of adjustment together. And preferably, I'm just going to go ahead and say it, I think creditors should adjust. They should be, any mechanism to send money back to the global south at this point would be a nice, small beginning to fix all of the stuff we've appropriated.
Do you have any other questions?
Hello. I have a relatively simple question from you. Any of you guys can answer. So, what's the way forward for the developing and underdeveloped nations? Because there is an impression of trap in the shield of debt and investments from the both sides, from the Western financial institutions and the countries, and from the China as well. So what's the way forward for the underdeveloping countries which are not developed and they need the capital which they don't have right now?
Sorry, could you rephrase?
Okay, so you're saying, what is the way forward for underdeveloped countries? who don't have the capital, but they're like stuck in this trap. And he's saying both from the Western side, but also from the Chinese.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a very big question. Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, that sounds like your territory, my friend.
So I think, you know, the traditional defense mechanism against the IMF, which a lot of Southeast and East Asian countries implemented after 1998, is to build up massive foreign reserves, right? To build up a war chest to prevent yourself from ever having to engage with the IMF again, which is essentially what like the UK and Italy and France also did in 1970s, 1980s. It's very embarrassing for a country in some ways, right? But that only gets you so far because that protects your individual country, but it doesn't fix the systemic issues. So I think, you know, to come back to the previous question, I think a balanced way to approach adjustment is a good start, but ultimately, you know, Omer was talking yesterday, he works with Jason Hickel, and one of the big insights that I've gained from this kind of economic framework is that there's a huge flow of resources today from global south countries to global north countries. So I think the real challenge is how do we reverse that? And how do we reverse that in a way that it makes sense to everyone? Because, yeah, most Dutch people don't realize that they are, after Hong Kong, the prime beneficiary of flows from the global south. Dutch people get subsidized to the tune of $8,000 per person every year from global south countries in terms of unequal exchange, trade barriers, all that stuff. That awareness, I think, is something that needs to change in the north. But I'm also not sure we can wait for that. So I applaud on some level, I applaud any kind of BRICS organizing to wrest some power from this kind of very Western-dominated financial institutions.
And if I may, like, just add a little bit, I'm not an expert on this, but I've studied the Pakistan-China corridor, economic corridor, and how it integrates into the new Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is why initiatives like these are very attractive for countries like Pakistan, because it allows you the freedom to choose your development prerogatives on your own terms, rather than having the one-size-fits-all formula in which, you know, you're being told from the outside that, you know, we're telling you what works. So I would say the way forward is building alternatives to the existing financial infrastructure that exists and that dominates the world, and, you know, which has got developing countries into a trap. That would be my
And how do we define resources, right? How do we define globalization? Because a lot of times we use that word, talk about globalizing world, and we're really, truly, strictly talking about capital. But what other iterations are there? Because there are people I talk to, you know, Colin Hines, who worked on the original text for what in the U.S. has become the Green New Deal, you know, finding new ways to describe ways that people and cultures and towns and nation states can interact with each other beyond the conversation about capital.
So this is what I'm actually, my next talk, this is what I'm going to focus on, is that when we talk about globalizing and we're talking about, you know, global governance, in that, then, you know, we need to put in the global in there. That means then the global south needs to have a voice in there, in the governance systems, in the financial infrastructure, you know, decision-making capacity, because that really, you know, the world as it is structured today does not reflect the moral, the demographic, and the economic realities of 2025. Like this, the world that we have today is the world that was built or conceived of in 1945, and that was a completely different era. So when you say globalization, what does that mean? Well, it means you're putting the global in the globalization, and it doesn't have to be that particular description of like making it just the flow of capital, just easing out, like removing obstructions. Yeah, it doesn't have to be that particular definition. So.
Yeah, and I would just add to that one thing that I find very hopeful from your history is this idea that we can actually reach across borders, and these globalizing forces, they do also, parts of that do also allow us to connect, and there's power there too. So, yeah, it does cut both ways, it seems.
Okay, so I think we're out of time as well, so I think we'll just wrap it up here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for participating. I hope
Thank you.
there's something that you got out of it.